Welcome to NAFI's Mentor Live program, Threat and Error Management. From successful strategies used by airlines, you'll learn how to adapt the principles to your flying and instructing. Paul Preidecker is the Chief Instructor and Examiner for a regional airline, overseeing its pilot training program. He has over 7,500 hours as an ATP certificate with type ratings in the CL65 and the DO328. He's a ground and gold seal flight instructor, a simulator and line check airman, an FAA Aircrew Program Designee, and an FAA Designated Observer with 6,800 plus hours of instruction given in Part 61 and 121 operations. Preidecker maintains his commitment to general aviation, instructing for 27 years, sharing his extensive experience in both GA and commercial aviation as a member of the NAFI Professional Development Program Committee, and volunteering in many other capabilities and capacities with industry and the FAA. An accomplished aviator and teacher, he aims to contribute to aviation safety using his training insights to blend accepted best practices between GA and Part 121. Welcome to eMentor, Paul.
Phil, thank you so much for that introduction, and I want to welcome all of our viewers to Mentor Live. It's an honor to be here, and I hope we have a good time to discuss, this topic of threat and error management and what it means to advance general aviation and talk about some current topics. So once again, I'm very pleased to be here, honored to be part of the group. Just a quick note about the title. I sort of a little bit of a play on words here. TEM building. What threat and error management will become is something that pilots can use in their toolkit or in their team to help manage risk. And risk management is, central to our, continued safe operations. So I just wanted to, express a way to say, this is something that, we can use. It's an active process to manage safety, and it's just part of our, can be part of our team. In your introduction, you said that I spend my time between the airlines and general aviation, and I, would just like to say that I've been in the airlines for about 18 years, and I can't imagine a more dynamic period in our time right now. The hiring opportunities in all facets of aviation are tremendous. We're in a growth economy. Major airlines are buying new aircraft, which of course need to be staffed. Regional airlines are hiring, corporate operators are hiring. There's opportunities for flight instructors. It's a wonderful time to be a pilot, and I'm happy to be a part of it, and I think the future is good. When I was thinking about how to introduce this, several things came to mind about how do I introduce this topic, and I'll just tell you a story. I have a very good friend of mine. His name is Mike, and he's a pilot friend. And some years ago, I was at his house having dinner, and we were just talking about pilots that we know, or some experiences I had recently in training. And I would make the comment about, well, so and so he's a good pilot. And Mike said to me, he says, well, what does that mean? What is a good pilot? And I paused for a moment. Of course, my first thought was, well, one like me, I'm a good pilot. But I tried to give it a little bit more thought, and I kind of narrowed it down to two things. I think a good pilot is somebody who is a true master of the aircraft, in terms of control and smoothness of how he flies the airplane. But also, a good pilot is a master of the situation, meaning not only do you have the good skills to, have aircraft control, but you also have an amazing ability to understand the situation that you're in, or the situation that you will be in. Ultimate, master of the situation combined with master of the aircraft, I think, is what makes a good pilot. And a few days ago, I had the chance to watch a movie that I had seen many times, and perhaps some of you have seen this, but, you know, it's Tom Wolfe's classic called The Right Stuff. And, you know, if you remember, there's a character in that movie, you know, played by Dennis Quaid, but he's playing the role of Gordon Cooper. And often through the movie, you know, Gordon is saying, you know, who's the best pilot, you know, you've ever seen? And, you know, his response would be, well, you're looking at him. And I thought, you know, I've often talked to our new hire classes when I'm making a presentation about, you know, their training and things like that. And I'm quick to say that Gordon got it all wrong, that I'm really the best pilot I've ever seen, as long as I'm not flying the airplane. When I'm doing observations on the airplane in a jump seat, I don't really miss too much because I'm not physically engaged with the aircraft. If I'm sitting in the back of a simulator doing a check ride, I don't miss too much because I'm not physically involved with the aircraft. Now, connect me to the airplane, well, stuff happens, you know? And I think that's what we're trying to achieve when we talk about risk management, is how do we maintain good control of the airplane, you know, when we're engaged in the act and the art of flying, and maintain, you know, exquisite situational awareness of all the things that are going on around us. So that's where we're going with this. And I think we can just get started and, you know, let's move on to the next slide. So there's all good flights, you know, we need a flight plan. And, you know, these are the things that we'll cover. You know, we'll do the basics, you know, what is threat air management? What are, you know, some of the training considerations that we need to discuss when we want to talk about how do we train threat air management. We'll jump back in history a little bit about where did it come from? How did it get started? Spend a little bit of time talking about how does it relate to CRM or SRM, single pilot resource management. Of course, there's a few terms associated with threat air management. I'll discuss some tools, you know, that we use to help, you know, mitigate some of the threats that come our way. And we'll kind of wrap up with an application to, you know, how we can apply this to general aviation. So, next slide, please. So, you know, first things first, this is a common adage. I mean, we hear this a lot. You know, accidents, you know, rarely occur due to a single event or an error. You know, they occur because there's some chain of events. I mean, we hear this from a very basic and, you know, primary training that, you know, there's an accident chain. So obviously, if we can take steps to break the chain, then, you know, we can stop an incident or an accident or you know, just some event that we don't want to be in. And the logic of this too is that if we break the chain at the earliest point, then we won't have to deal with the compounding of multiple errors. So if we have multiplying effects of errors, they're going to be more and more difficult to manage. So the sooner we can do this, you know, the better. When we talk about events, they can be anything. I mean, all of us can imagine, you know, the events that we're talking about here. Weather changes, you know, mechanical issues, you know, airport construction that might affect the available runways. I mean, all of these things are events that we have to consider and manage in order to maintain safety. Additionally, you know, our own decision-making process, if we make the wrong decision, that in and of itself can become an event that we may later need to manage to help mitigate risk. Next slide, please. So let's do the basics. TEM is just short for threat and error management. It's a safety process that automatically assumes that we operate in a very complex environment, that we will make mistakes, and that we're going to operate with some level of risk. So it's important to realize that threat error management acknowledges the type of environments that we're in, and that our continued goal of mitigating risk, managing the threats, managing the errors that are possibly made will keep us on a safe path. Threat error management is simply a safety process that helps us do that. Now, risk management is an essential part of the airman certification standards. Those have been put into place for some of the certificates. And, to kind of summarize, the new ACS is basically adding aeronautical knowledge, risk management to each PTS task. And, to kind of borrow from the language of the ACS, the three elements, that comprise airman certification standards are know, consider, and do. And the know part is obviously the knowledge. The consider part is the process where we're using, aeronautical decision making and risk management as a key component. And then the do part, of course, is the task itself, whatever that might be. Now, also, from our very earliest days, we were told to prioritize how we manage our flight. And very simply, it was aviate, navigate, and communicate. We still, we teach that today in general aviation. We teach it in the Part 121 environment. But if you look at some of the recent publications from the FAA, including the FAA safety briefing, there are articles in there now that talk about not only aviate, navigate, and communicate, but also mitigate. And mitigate is not, the fourth step actually, but mitigate is kind of the umbrella applied to all the rest of them, so that we have things to mitigate in the way we aviate, the way we navigate, and the way we communicate. So, threat error management is just another way of accomplishing risk management. It's something that we can train. It's kind of an action-oriented process. And it blends in well, I think, with the initiatives of the Airman Certification Standards, because as I said, those standards have built in risk management into the process. So let's move on, please, to the next slide. So we talked a little bit about, we're trying to manage, threats, and we're trying to manage errors. And, we can, we toss these terms around a little bit. And if we just kind of take a step back and say, well, what's a threat and what's an error? Well, let's have a look. A threat is something that's coming at us. And, there's a variety of threats that come at us, and, we'll go through and create some categories for them. But all of the things that are kind of coming at us, from the time we, start the engines until we, park in at the FBO and, call it a flight, all through that, we've had some threats. And, we often talk about go, no-go decisions. I personally, I go through that process, but during a flight, I'm not really talking about go, no-go, but during a flight, I'm doing more of a start, continue, because as threats come my way, if I can successfully manage them, of course, I'll continue. If I think that something is not working out quite right, for example, unforecast weather, then I might make a decision to divert or do something different. So again, the very basics are threats come at us. So what's an error? Well, an error is something that comes from us. I mean, these are our mistakes. The little caption below this picture, this aircraft is pulling onto the runway, is the pilot saying, was I supposed to hold short of that runway? Well, that's an odd time to be asking it, because if you've already crossed the whole short line and you weren't sure that you were supposed to, you just made an error. There's a number of errors that we've all made. I mean, if you just try to look at any flight that we do and you say, I'm going to try to make this the perfect flight. Well, suppose, you know, you're trying to hold 105 knots on your approach, but you're now holding 110. That's an error, and you just kind of deviated from perfect. But of course, perfect is our goal. So again, threats come at us, errors come from us, and threat error management is a way to sort of manage all of that. Next slide, please. So what this training is about is how do we recognize them? You know, how do we recognize the threats and errors that are part of our flight? What are some of the tools that we can use to manage them and, you know, prevent them from becoming the second, you know, or the third link in the accident chain? And third, how do we prevent what we call an undesired aircraft state? In the very worst case, an undesired aircraft state could be an incident or an accident, but an undesired aircraft state could also be that aircraft that had crossed the runway before he was given the clearance. An undesired aircraft state could be we didn't extend the flaps for landing. So we're just trying to prevent those states. It does not teach you how to fly. I mean, we've sort of already got the flying part figured out in terms of the mechanical skills. And like I said, what I think a good pilot is somebody who masters his aircraft, but combines that and balances that with mastering his situation, whatever that, you know, situation might be. And next slide, please. So when we are training threat error management, we immediately acknowledge that we're in a complex environment. And the complexity, you know, we can define that however we want. I mean, if we are flying in busy airspace, that can be part of the complex environment, or going into an uncontrolled, non-towered airport that you've never been to before, that might in itself be a complex environment. So we just start with the idea that we operate in a complex environment. And as part of our procedures and as part of our aircraft, we have what we call hard and soft safeguards, which help us with risk management, but they may not actually be sufficient. So let me pick up on this just a little bit. When we talk about hard safeguards, these are the safeguards that are in our equipment. New initiatives for ADS-B by 2020. Your autopilot is a safeguard to ensure flight path management. A new GPS is a piece of equipment that's a hard safeguard. In the Part 121 environment, we have some other advanced equipment that are safeguards in terms of ground proximity warning systems. So we have these hard safeguards. We also have the soft safeguards, which is simply, you know, our checklist, you know, the procedures, the pilot operating handbook, our own training, you know, how we conduct briefings. But, you know, the one thing that occurs to me is that as the equipment, you know, what we would call the hard safeguards, as it gets more and more complex, that in and of itself might become a threat. And if I go back and use my friend Mike as an example again, Mike has a very nice airplane, and he lets me fly it from time to time, so we share some time in it. And he decided to upgrade his panel, and of course it all started with ADS-B, but then it developed into something, you know, more significant. And it's wonderful technology, but we both decided it would really be a good idea to take a class in this and to get some education on all of this equipment. So we spent some, you know, time at the manufacturer's facility, basically in a 2-day class with a desktop simulator to learn a little bit more about this equipment. And it was amazingly well done, and it was time very well spent. And I was often brought back to thinking about, you know, the cockpit of an airplane is a terrible classroom. If you're trying to learn a new panel by yourself, I think you're going to be very challenged. Even in a two-pilot situation, you have to have some division of responsibility so that, you know, while somebody's trying to learn the menu options to get into the GPS, somebody else is maintaining control of the aircraft. So as much as I embrace and really like new technology, I think we have to be careful that that in and of itself doesn't become a threat leading to some more errors. I mean, I think it's very easy if you put two pilots in an airplane for both of you to be looking at what's inside and, you know, ignore a little bit about what's going on outside. And of course, you know, somebody always has to be watching outside. So Phil, I know you and I talked about this a little bit earlier. If you had something to say about that.
You know, there are a couple of things, Paul. I think to sort of summarize what you were saying and expand it a bit is in general aviation, I think we tend to take the presence of just some mixture of equipment as, okay, that's what we're flying today, where in reality, the variation from airplane to airplane in itself is a pretty significant threat. And how might you suggest addressing that when you're instructing different airplanes, same make and model, but with quite different configurations of navigation and avionics and so on?
Yeah, it's I'll bring this up in the later slides about, you know, we've all probably had the experience of teaching in an unfamiliar aircraft, and that's sometimes not so easy. I mean, it's an airplane, right? We should be able to do this, but as you said, Phil, the panel layouts are different. There's instrumentation that we may ourselves not be familiar with. And these are the sort of things that as a flight instructor, we can start compounding the problems. And it, you know, gets in the way of mitigating our, you know, the risk that we're trying to deal with. Just to pick up a little bit more on the soft safeguards, like I said, these are just the things that, you know, are available to us, you know, checklists, procedures, training, you know, briefings, you know, if you have a two-pilot crew or, you know, student and instructor, I think it's very important that we, you know, conduct a thorough briefing about how we intend the flight to go and what, you know, the expectations are. When we say there's no such thing as a perfect flight, I have administered about 1,100 Part 121 check rides. I can tell you that there is no such thing as a perfect check ride, and there's no such thing as a perfect flight, even though, you know, we say that perfect is the goal. But that is really kind of the essence of threat and error management, is to say it's not going to be perfect, but, you know, as pilots who are mastering the aircraft and mastering our situation, we can keep the errors to a minimum and, you know, enhance the safety of the operation. So,
yeah, I think something that you said there goes back to something you said earlier that's also a point that occasionally gets missed. You talked about how threat and error management is a process, and yet I've had so many pilots I've flown with or trained that will start through when they have a triggering event. Something may happen that was a little unexpected, and they'll go through their mental checklist, but they get to a hard stop until something else happens. And I think one of the key points in threat and error management of the differences that can occur in an airplane just on a random basis is you have to have some sort of baseline mental checklist that you're constantly running in flight, that you're considering. You're just checking in every minute or two or three or whatever the appropriate time interval is to say, okay, how are we doing on fuel? How are we doing on flight plan? How are we doing on all our avionics and equipment state and so on? And I think that's really important to have that as a process that repeats and doesn't simply wait for an event to occur and then apply it.
That's exactly right. You know, for owners of their own aircraft, you know, they're intimately familiar with their aircraft, and I think that in time you get so comfortable that you might not start paying attention to some of these things, because you just have a comfort level. My plane always works. What could possibly go wrong? It's a beautiful day. But you're right. I mean, when we talk about, I often talk to people about, a scan. We all know the instrument scan that we're talking about. But in reality, the scan is much broader than that. It's not just of your instruments, but it's of the entire situation. Where are we, in time and space? As you say, the fuel, just monitoring things, on a fairly regular basis, just to stay ahead of things. I mean, we're really trying to prevent things from happening, not, as you said, not react to them after they happen. When I talk about situational awareness again, if somebody said, well, give me another example of that, I would say, well, if you're on an instrument flight plan and you're kind of got the other frequencies in your headset, and you start hearing about holding instructions at some airport that you happen to be going to, that should tell you something. That should tell you that perhaps I need to start planning to hold. How will I do that? Do I have the fuel for this? And if you know about that, 20 miles ahead rather than 2 miles ahead, it just puts you farther ahead in the game. So it's another way to, just say we have to, maintain our situation to, keep the risk low and not let the errors creep in. Next slide, please. So this is an easy one. If you just wanted to have a quick way of looking at what threat error management really is, I would say it's defensive driving for pilots. We've all seen offensive drivers. We know what that looks like. The thing that makes us safe is to be a defensive driver and be on guard at all the times, kind of expecting the worst. My former flight instructor from many years ago always said, just expect the unexpected. And, if you keep that in mind, you can maintain a margin of safety.
A question that we've had come in from an audience on that that's perfectly for what you're just saying. Alan asks, what can I do to help remember the tasks at the right time?
So that's a very good question. I myself, and feel free to, share your own advice on this, Phil, but I generally try to look at phase of flight, and after some transitional event, a level off from a climb, a level off from a descent, crossing over a VOR, taking up a new course, every time I have kind of a transitional event, I'll go back and kind of rescan to make sure that everything that I want to do and everything that, is in front of me is set up correctly. We rely so much on our, GPS and, the magenta line to say, well, let's just go direct. I always make sure that if I make a course change to a VOR or an intersection, that I'm always using my GPS to make sure that it shows that I'm in fact going there. I don't make those assumptions. So again, transitional events are is what triggers it for me. There's certain things we do when we level off in terms of mixture, adjusting the mixture, prop, throttle, maybe the cowl flaps. There's certain things we do when we're leveling off from a descent. When we start getting into the approach phase, I think we all, use that as a trigger to, it's time to change the radios. And it is not a one size fits all for everybody. It's aircraft dependent, situation dependent, but I think all of us kind of develop our own system to address what Alan has said.
Yeah, and I think that ties back to what we had said earlier, and that's to have the sort of continual checklist that's running all the time. It can pace differently based on it, but when a transition event occurs, and that's the time to run that checklist as a bare minimum.
Exactly. Next slide, please. So this is not me, on that motorcycle, but I do have a motorcycle that's out in my garage. And for those of you who perhaps enjoy motorcycles, I think you can imagine and relate to the fact that a motorcycle and the act of riding a motorcycle is the ultimate in threat area management, because everything is out to get you. You've got your own skills, you've got mechanical issues, certainly you have weather, obstructions, other vehicles, the list can go on and on and on. And I'd have to say that I have sort of a, I wouldn't say love-hate relationship with my motorcycle, but it's something close to that. When I'm not on it, I think about getting on and riding. When I am on it, I think about getting hurt, because everything is, you're so exposed. But I've actually thought, you know, could I write an article for a motorcycle magazine, call it threat area management, you know, for motorcycles from the pilot's perspective, and apply some of these same concepts? Because, you know, as I said, those of you who have ridden motorcycles know that the threats are significant, and your own errors or the errors of other people are significant. When I get in an airplane, the thought of having an incident or an accident never occurs to me. When I'm on a motorcycle, about every mile I'm thinking about it. So it's just another way to express, you know, this concept of risk management. So, what about you, Phil? Do you have a motorcycle?
No, I have never been attracted to the motorcycle. I figured airplanes were a good place to start and stop.
I've been advised that I should do the same. So. All right, next slide, please. Well, where did all this start? It goes back in time a little bit. Back in the mid-1990s, some researchers at the University of Texas at Austin went into a cooperative study with a major airline at that time. And what they wanted to do was to come up with a way to measure procedural compliance and crew resource management. And they put together a program called a LOSA, which stands for Line Operational Safety Audit. And the way that works, because there's, in the 121 environment, there's still opportunities to do that. But basically, you put trained observers in the jump seat of your aircraft, and they basically watch, you know, a flight from A to B, and they collect data on exactly what they saw in terms of procedural compliance, non-compliance, were the CRM skills sufficient. So that's kind of where it started. And they used, at that time, they used threat area management as the model to measure the errors. So if I could, you know, just expand on this a little bit, we, in our training, in the 121 environment, in our training and checking events, we have a measuring scale. It's just a simple 5-point scale, but it's all based on threat area management. And, you know, to run through the basics, if a particular task, for example, you know, taxiing the aircraft, if everything was done to procedure and was done correctly, then the pilot or the crew would get a 5. The scale keeps going down, of course. You know, a 4 would be that there were some threats or there were some errors, but they were trapped. In other words, because of some threat, and, you know, an error was made, but it was immediately caught. You can imagine, wrong frequency on the radio. Initially bugged the wrong altitude, but you caught it. So these are all what we call trapped errors. The next part of the scale was you had an untrapped error, which means you made a mistake and didn't catch it, but there were no safety consequences because of it. The next part of this would be you had an untrapped error with a safety consequence. And the last part of the scale was if there was not some intervention on the part of a crew member, you could be leading yourself towards a violation or an incident or an accident. So they used this kind of a scale to measure what they saw in terms of procedural compliance and how effective crew resource management became. But pretty early on in all of this, they decided that not only should threat error management be the measuring tool, but it should also be part of the strategy to mitigate risk. So from just a purely historical perspective, that's how all this happened. And it's this and variations of it are still being used today in a 121 environment. Of course, I'm trying to make the case for saying that, we can use it in the general aviation world to do exactly the same thing. I think there's a question there. Can you introduce that, Phil?
Yes. Roger says, I miss checklist items on most flight. I miss something, typically small things, but it bothers me. How do you suggest a person minimize the checklist misses?
So I wish that I knew in the environment that Roger was working in. I'm assuming it might be single pilot. Sometimes what I do is, or what I have found is that sometimes the checklist itself can become a distraction because you're kind of moving before, you're going from the checklist items to whatever the item is, and you're kind of doing it back and forth. I've always taught, flows. The way you start an aircraft, you do a certain flow. The way you set up for an approach, you do a certain flow. But you back it up with a checklist to make sure that what you thought you did, you actually accomplished. I mean, many of us, certainly when I first learned to fly, we were sort of taught to use flows, mnemonics, were memory aids that we would use, and then back that up with a checklist so that the checklist itself and your interaction with it didn't become a distraction. In the 121 environment, we cannot live without checklists, and checklists work great. But the reason they work great is there's two of us doing them. Somebody's accomplishing the task and somebody else is verifying it with a checklist. In a single pilot environment, I sort of see that the flow followed by the checklist is a better way of accomplishing it.
Let me ask you a question about that in GA training. I've only seen a handful of instructors over the years in my environment in general aviation that utilized flows. Would you recommend using that with the smaller, much less sophisticated airplanes?
I like them. I like flows because, like I said, I've seen cases where a checklist might become a distraction, and as Roger says, he sometimes misses things. You're in good company though, Roger. I can assure you that even in the two-person environment, things get missed, especially if we're responding to abnormal or emergency procedures. We have checklists there to prevent that, but in the heat of the battle, sometimes, we do miss things. I like flows followed by checklist. It might not be appropriate for everybody or every aircraft. Of course, the challenge is you're not going to find those in your aircraft flight manual. You're going to have to come up with a flow yourself and then adapt the checklist to follow it.
And I'm glad you got to that, because that was sort of what I found works well, is to help the student develop a set of flows, even on a 152 or 172 basic airplane, and then allow them the time to use that rather than jumping in when something happens and sort of getting frustrated that, well, we're supposed to have a 2-hour lesson, but we've already eaten up 15 minutes by delay for takeoff, and so let's just skip that and go to the lesson. I think that's one of the things that's really important on the instructional side, is to say with the discipline of how you use flows if you're using them, and how you use checklists when you use them.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, there are different checklist philosophies. We have checklists that we refer to as read and do. You read it, you go do it. But we have other checklists that are more challenge response. And the challenge response is really designed for a crew type environment where one crew member, you know, will issue the challenge and the other crew member will respond with whatever the action was. There's not a reason in the world, in my opinion, that you can't apply challenge response to the flow checklist scenario, because you've done the action and now you're challenging yourself to make sure.
And especially at the bottom end of aviation, the GA light singles and light twins, I think that's one of the discipline that would really help the overall accident rate, would be if we developed the discipline to do that much more consistently. Than's been my experience.
Yeah, exactly. It's a good question. Next slide, please. So just chat for a little bit. Where does CRM kind of play, you know, with TEM? You know, since I've been in aviation, I've heard CRM referred to as cockpit resource management. I've heard crew resource management. I've heard a variation of it called company resource management. It's resources, and however you define them. And, you know, CRM in general is about recognizing the, you know, resources available to you. You know, in the airlines, we actually have it pretty easy. You know, we have dispatchers who are helping us with weather and flight planning. We have air traffic control, of course. You know, if the airplane breaks, we just call maintenance, you know, go get coffee while they fix it. So, you know, we have a variety of resources, you know, that we can use. In general aviation, we still have resources. Flight service stations, of course. Air traffic control is a huge resource to us. You know, your partner pilot passenger is a resource to you. And let's not forget all of the wonderful flight planning tools we have. I mean, everything that's deployed on an iPad. I mean, I consider that, if I'm single pilot, I consider my iPad part of my crew. I mean, it's a resource to me that, you know, I have access to. So CRM is, you know, traditionally been about personality profiles, styles of communication. It's not really about, you know, do two people get along? That's not really, you know, what's involved. It is more about, are we using the resources effectively? So I would say that, you know, crew resource management is more conceptual in nature. Threat area management, as I think we're trying to develop here, it's much more of an action-oriented. It gives you things that you can do, that we can teach, that we can measure, and, you know, compared to CRM, I think it's more, you know, practical in nature. I sort of see, you know, threat area management as the umbrella for how we, you know, manage a flight, and CRM is one of those elements that's under the umbrella as a tool to be used. It's just like we brought up earlier, the aviate, navigate, communicate mantra really now as an umbrella has mitigate over it. It's just another way of expressing, you know, risk management. So let's move on, please. So get down to a few more of the terms here. We've already said that threats are something that come at us. We can, you know, further define them as, you know, they occur, you know, outside the pilot's ability to influence. They absolutely increase the complexity of the flight, and usually they increase the complexity of the flight because it just takes time to manage. all the time we spend managing things that are coming at us means we might not be managing something else. And of course, threats require some kind of attention, in order to, maintain our safety margins. They can be divided, into three categories. I've sort of, thrown this into operational threats, which are, things that are kind of coming from our airplane, malfunctions, for example, and the malfunctions can either, some piece of equipment that's not essential to the airplane may not be working before we leave, or, we have a malfunction in flight, which is a little bit more of an issue, or, maybe there's just poor procedures, or maybe the cockpit layout is not ideal. So there's some things that just come to us as kind of part of the operation. The environmental threats, of course, are the obvious ones. Weather, air traffic control, we can imagine all kinds of scenarios about changing weather, the whole VMC into IMC scenarios. Weather's not as forecast. Those are obvious threats to us. Air traffic control is as well. Complicated procedures, communication. I mean, we've all dealt with the controllers that talk so fast that, we can't keep up. I mean, that in and of itself, is a threat if we can't manage that. And then the last category of threats are, what we call mismanaged. It might be a stretch to think that, in a light twin aircraft, if you've had an engine failure, that you might shut down the wrong one. But I've seen accident data to suggest that has happened. More likely, if you're doing twin engine training, if the engine quits, you might be stepping on the wrong rudder. So, if we don't manage the threats well, then they just simply become mismanaged, obviously with some more consequences. Next slide, please. So we may not always be able to see, all of the threats. I mean, we certainly have the observable ones. I mean, if you look out, if in the distance and see a thunderstorm and you see it in time, well, you can mitigate that by, deviating or diverting or whatever the strategy might be. So there are known observable threats, but of course, unexpected, an unexpected threat, engine failure would certainly be part of that scenario. But we also have what I would call latent threats. Things like how your cockpit is laid out. Maybe the fuel gauges are blocked from your view. You've got some equipment design issues that are not optimal. The air traffic system. Around the country, my impression is air traffic is getting a little bit more complicated because of some of the procedures. But again, as I mentioned earlier, even if you're flying into a non-towered, uncontrolled airport, there could be complications with just transitioning from, controlled to uncontrolled airspace, and how are you going to do that? I know if you live in the Washington, D.C. area, you're challenged by the special flight rules that surround our nation's capital, and that is something that constantly has to be managed to make sure that you're not in the wrong place. The other kind of a latent threat, if you're part of a flight school or an organization, there may be, some threats associated with that in terms of, student load. You have a lot of students. There might be some pressure to get more people trained or more people signed off. So there could be some organizational culture in that environment, that we put into the category of a latent threat. Next one, please. So the errors, and as I said, the errors are things that come from us. They lead to a deviation from, operational intentions or expectations. Most errors reduce safety margins to some extent, and, they increase the probability of some, adverse event either in flight or on the ground. Like threats, errors come into three categories. The simplest are just aircraft handling errors. You're not on the speed you would like to be at. You're not configured properly. You haven't put the flaps down for landing. You haven't put the flaps down for takeoff. You crossed the whole short line. I mean, that means you have had an aircraft handling mistake if you have your aircraft not where it's intended to be. And of course, there's automation errors. I mean, as much as I said earlier, I really love and embrace technology. The more complex it gets, the more chances are you may make an error in just managing the automation. Procedural errors. These can either be intentional or non-intentional, deviations from, a regulation, a rule, your pilot operating handbook, the airplane flight manual. I've done some work with the NTSB, and they've published some material about procedural compliance. And they've published a paper some years ago, but I think it's very valid. It says that if a pilot or a crew intentionally deviates from a procedure, that they're going to be 7 times more likely to continue doing that. And that's obviously a slippery slope, that we want to try to avoid. Sterile cockpit. I mean, I have a feeling that that's one of the most broken rules, in aviation, is having non-essential conversation, during some critical phase of flight. But there can be other things. Descending below minimums is an example. There's other things that you could probably think of. And it just shows that if you intentionally deviate, you might start walking down a path of continuing that. And that's a path, we try to avoid. The last error is communication errors. My goodness, we make them all the time, right? Read back things incorrectly. So we have communication errors with our air traffic controllers. There's communication errors between the pilot and the instructor, and they just have to be, managed and mitigated. Next slide, please. So the other term is, we addressed this briefly, undesired aircraft state. It's basically another error or safety compromising event called an undesired aircraft state. It just simply means that the aircraft is not in a position, speed, altitude, or configuration that you want it to be in. It's almost always going to reduce safety margins to some extent, and it's primarily our own fault. It's going to be from our own, errors, actions, or inactions. Next one, please. So this is a good news, bad news thing. The bad news is that humans are the problem, but the good news is that we're also the solution. Most of our threats are caused by, other humans' errors, but most of the errors, especially our own, sometimes go undetected. And if they go undetected long enough, then, we could lead to a undesired aircraft state. Threat error management training absolutely recognizes that if you're trying to eliminate all errors, you just signed up for Mission Impossible. You can't. You can't. The challenge, as we said before, is to have this broad situational awareness that says, oh, I just made a mistake, now I have to go fix it. Now, we're the solution, obviously, and this bullet point I have here says that pilots are the last line of defense. Let's think about what that means for a moment. I think about it in terms of what being a PIC means. Being a PIC means that we are the final authority as to the safe operation of the flight. So, for example, we trust our mechanics to do the work that it was assigned for them to do, but it is up to us to make sure that we pre-flight the aircraft properly and to make sure all the paperwork is done. we trust the fuel guy to top off our tanks, but it's up to us to make sure he did. We trust ATC, to make sure they're doing their job, but sometimes they make mistakes. And in fact, I heard an interesting statistic a few weeks ago that was presented by the FAA that 48% of air traffic controllers are in training. Well, that tells you right there that the air traffic control system, just like the pilots, there could be opportunities for mistakes. So even though we have trust in the mechanic, we have trust in the fuel guy, we have trust in ATC, the bottom line is we're the last line of defense to make sure that we're catching all these things. And I guess the best way I could describe this interrelationship, with these outside influences is an expression that I suspect you'll recognize, Phil. Expression that came out of the 80s: trust but verify.
Indeed.
So I think that's our role. We trust these people to do the work, but as a last line of defense, we're it because we're the PIC. So
it's probably a good place to put in a question. We just got Roger asked, from a management point of view, how do you promote threat and error management with students?
Well, I think that it's best promoted by going through not necessarily this presentation, but by taking some of these things away from this presentation and sort of saying that every flight we're going to, if you're in a single pilot situation or a student instructor situation or a two pilot situation, every flight you'll actually make a list of the things that are a potential threat. The weather, for example, changing weather. All of the things that could be coming at you that you potentially know about. Once you're in the flight, I think, as we've talked about, Phil, this kind of continual kind of review of how things are going, I think will help present threats to us. Once we've identified the threats, all we have to do is to stay on guard to prevent those things from turning into errors. My goal in this sort of presentation would be to suggest a way to create some guidelines and some curriculum for general aviation pilots to be able to take these same principles and just apply it to our general aviation world. I do think by just having an awareness of some of these things we've talked about, it will just heighten, your senses about what to expect and what to do if you see something that comes to unexpected. So I'm all for trying to, bring these principles into the GA world, because there's so many opportunities here.
One of the ways that we used in the flight school that I owned for a number of years back in Long Island, it was more in the risk management era, but I think what we were doing applies. And that is, we had about once every 18 months or so, I would take some of the mid-level instructors, ones who were just beginning to take supervisory or managerial positions before moving on, and put them together in a team of 4 or 5 people to go back and do a review of exactly the kind of things that you're talking about. And it gave them a sense of what they were doing, but they almost invariably would also bring some of their students into the discussion informally, but it really helped get that idea done in a way that we paid them a few bucks. They made some extra money on it, so they liked it. We usually did it during an off period in Long Island. That was November, December. You could usually count on getting some days to work on it.
Yeah.
And folks liked it, and it seemed to work pretty well.
Very good. Next slide, please. So here's some specific tools. Basically, there's 3 of them: anticipation, recognition, and recovery. And anticipation is probably is the key to success, because you expect the unexpected. If you're always on guard, then your level of vigilance will be at a higher level. And I think vigilance is one of the biggest keys to being successful with this, but I also think it's the hardest thing to maintain. As I said before, you get into your own airplane time after time after time, everything's easy, you go maybe between the same two airports, what could possibly go wrong? If you have this idea that something might go wrong and you keep your vigilance at a high level, I think you have a better chance to succeed. Leaving anticipation and going to recognition, that's another strategy here, is that it's one thing to be on the wrong heading or the wrong altitude or the wrong frequency. You have to recognize that. And once you recognize it, then obviously you have to recover and apply whatever corrective action you have to do. In the 121 world, and if we program something into the flight management system, and all of a sudden, we're saying to each other, "What's it doing now?" You have to turn it off. You can't wonder what's it going to do when it's not doing what you expect. You have to disengage, resume manual control, and then go figure it out later. So anticipation, recognition, and recovery, to me, are the essential tools for how to apply these concepts. I also think that in the student-instructor relationship, we have to be on guard as instructors, because as time goes on with our students, we get comfortable with them. We see them progress. We know their skill set, but it doesn't mean we can let our own guard down as an instructor. We still have to be vigilant. I think that's probably where the concept of sweating only on one side of your face comes from. You don't let your students see you sweat, but it's okay if you're sweating a little bit. I think that means you're doing your job because you're always on guard. Next slide, please. So these tools, anticipation is a strategy. That's a strategy for success. They prepare us for what threats and errors may be coming. Other strategies, include briefings, for example. And I'm a big fan on briefing, especially in a student instructor relationship, because I've had people say to me that well, my instructor told me to just go pre-flight the airplane and he'll come out, but they haven't really briefed what they're going to do, and that's really kind of a disservice to the entire process, because we have to brief what the lesson's going to be about. And once we're in the aircraft, we have to brief about, the expected outcome and how things are going to go. In the 121 environment, we rely on briefings a lot, because what we're trying to do is to create what I call a shared mental model. So if you create a shared mental model about how this flight's going to be, then everybody's on the same page, and you can enhance, crew resource management. So anticipation is a type of strategy. The recognition and recovery are simply countermeasures. So, countermeasures are things like trapping, a threat or an error, and try to keep it from, having a multiple compounding effect. Next slide, please. So I've used these terms before. I just want to bring up a couple of, examples. A trapped error is absolutely the first step in reducing the error chain. If you have an untrapped error, it could lead to a safety issue or not. It depends a little bit on the situation. Let's go to the next slide for another example. Let's suppose you're going to fly an instrument approach into some airport, and you fail to note or brief or program or set the missed approach altitude. Well, failing to set the missed approach altitude is the error. If you don't do anything about it, that becomes an untrapped error. But if you don't miss, then it doesn't really matter. There's no safety consequence of that. If you do miss and you find yourself at an altitude that's not appropriate because you didn't set the correct altitude, now you have a safety problem. So that's a little bit how we we break down the trapped and untrapped errors, whether or not they lead to safety consequences or not. Next slide. So I'm sitting here in the heart of Wisconsin. So of course I've got to talk about cheese, right? And the Swiss cheese model is certainly not something that's new. It's a fairly common expression about how to look at the accident chain. The whole idea is if you get too many holes to line up, you've had some threats that turned into errors that maybe became untrapped. You didn't mitigate them, and now you have some undesired aircraft state. So I just have to throw a plug in for our, the Dairyland state. So next slide.
Before we go on,
yeah.
Not to ask a cheesy question, but Dan asks, have threat checklists been developed?
So, to my knowledge, in the GA world, I haven't seen them. I will tell you that in the 121 environment, we talk about known threats as part of our briefings. Take a simple example. You're at a fairly busy airport, but there's taxiway construction. And the taxiway construction means that you're not going to be taxiing along a route that you're more familiar with. That taxiway construction is briefed as a threat, just like hotspots on the taxiway diagram. Those are briefed as threats, so that as you get near the hotspot, everybody's kind of got their head on a swivel to make sure you're not going to have an incursion. I think that the key to this is to just, whether you're single pilot or not, I think you can make notes about this and say, these are the things that I know about. And if you know about those, you're in a better position to mitigate them. So where does this going for general aviation? I mean, obviously, I feel that it has a wide adaptability to flight instruction, single pilot, general aviation ops, multi-pilot. But for the moment, let's just have a look at flight instruction. Next slide, please. So this is a near copy of the PAVE model. The PAVE, PAVE model is something that is popular in general aviation, combined with some other things about, are we ready? Do we understand what's coming at us? It's like the I'm safe checklist. And basically I took that, modified it slightly, and said that there are 4 threats in general in our flight instructing world. The pilot himself, instead of personal, I put in pilot, his skill set or lack of skill, the aircraft, which is an example of maybe mechanical malfunctions, the environment, of course, weather, airport, and then there are external pressures, maybe completion pressure from the student. So let's look at the pilot ones on the next slide, please. Certainly experience level has to be considered as a threat. If you have a brand new student who's never been in an airplane before, I mean, that's going to cause you to manage that flight a lot differently than if you have somebody with quite a bit of experience. So I think experience level through the gamut needs to be recognized and managed. And I think we also have to be careful not to assume. I mean, I've done flight instruction, with people who have more time than I do. You get in a 172 RG and, the gentleman needs a flight review and he's got all kinds of time and you think, oh, this will be easy. You can't make that assumption really. Just because somebody has a commercial multi-engine land certificate, that doesn't tell you the experience. It just tells you his certificate. More and more, I know the flight schools are language skills, are a threat. And from the instructor standpoint, where's the threat? Well, it's between the student and the instructor. And I think to mitigate it as instructors, we just have to use more precise language. I try not to speak in colloquialisms or jokes or slang. Just try to be precise and do pilot speak, in clear terms. But just because, you do that doesn't necessarily mean your student is understood. You have to do some checking and maybe ask questions to verify the understanding. So, we see this in the 121 environment as well, as more foreign nationals come into the country because it's less expensive to train here. It's the same for all the people that are coming into, the 4-year programs. Many of those individuals have English as their second language, and it's something that has to be managed. The other, part of the threats that come from pilots are just, behavior, attitudes, learning styles. Sometimes in our new hire classes, we may have a new hire candidate who is in his late 50s, and we may have a candidate who is 23. And I can tell you that the older individual is very happy to be in a classroom discussion environment, and the younger individual basically wants us to give it everything to him on his iPad and send him home. So, and in the in the cockpit, there's certainly differences about how we should relate to one another. I know, Phil, you and I were talking about that a little bit earlier. Maybe you could elaborate on that.
On which point, Paul?
On the, the old and the new.
Oh, yeah, with the instructors, you have that. And I think an example that I've used a long time ago, and it always got the perk of the ear and the eye from FAA and other folks, but that would be to go out and a lot of the airport meetings and FAA meetings of the general community would be talking, and I'd listen to what they're coming up with, all these complex plans of how they're going to solve some problem. The hotspot issue was one that actually came out of Farmingdale where I was, and part of that solution. And what really got the attention was when everybody said, yeah, we'll do this and this and this. And I said, I represent the least competent pilots on this airport. And everybody gave me a strange look with that. I said, they're all students. They're brand new. They don't know what they're doing. We can't be building these really complex procedures that guys have got 8,000-10,000 hours can easily adapt to. We've got people over here that are soloing with, in our school, probably 20, 22, 24 hours at a very busy airport. And I think when you take that perspective, it really draws out how you have different issues with the old pilots and the new pilots and how you approach it.
And we're not in a world where one size fits all in terms of training. I mean, as instructors, I think we really need to do our job to listen and tailor our training to the individual. So next slide, please. So obviously the threat from an aircraft, either mechanical problems that we may start out with or mechanical problems that develop in flight. For me, teaching in an unfamiliar aircraft is something that I'm very careful with. I don't like getting into an airplane I'm not really familiar with. Even though the person in the left seat might say, well, I'm PIC, I'll say, I understand that, but I still want to, have some familiarity with the aircraft and, the cockpit layouts and things like that. The same with flying into an unfamiliar airport. I think that's always a threat in our instructional world, or in a two-person environment, or by ourselves. The picture on the right is, you're going in kind of a mountainous terrain. I see snow. Maybe that means there's something on the runway. So all of these things, are kind of threats that are coming to us from the aircraft. But if we know about them, we're in a better position to, manage them. I think, the other part of this is we have to make sure that we don't get complacent. I mean, checking weather, checking NOTAMs, doing it the right way every time, we'll build a pattern, that will lead to continued success. Just because you go to the same airport doesn't mean that the next time you go to it, something won't be there or something will be different. And if you didn't check the NOTAMs, then you could find yourself, trying to manage a safety issue. Next slide. So, these are obvious. We have an aircraft that's, on top of the deck and possibly in a VFR situation. So weather, in the instructional environment, we have to keep track of the weather. ATC and airspace challenges, especially the more complicated airspace. And then just airport conditions. I mean, even to the point of, being familiar with where the hangar buildings are on a windy day so that you can anticipate maybe some low-level turbulence close to the ground. I mean, if you have that kind of a picture, you're in a better position to manage it. And next slide. So this one's a little bit tougher to deal with because, it's external pressures. As you develop a relationship with your student, you might become friends. You want to see him succeed, but you have to make sure that you don't let your friendship get in the way of making sure you're doing the right thing. I've worked with students who have said, I've got, financial constraints, I need to get signed off, or I need to get signed off so I can, move on to my new job. I think we need to remember that as students, or I'm sorry, as instructors and examiners, that, our main mission is safety. These other factors we have to manage and realize that at the end of the day, safety is the only thing we should, really care about. You might have pressure from your flight school in terms of schedules and number of students. High student volume could contribute to fatigue. I mean, we've all been there. We've all flown when we're tired. But it's, again, recognize that that is a threat so that you're in a better position to deal with it. And our next slide, please. So we're near the end here. This is the main thing from an instructor standpoint. Remember all the things that we talked about. We're going to make errors. We know our students will make errors. A good instructor is somebody who can anticipate the errors that his student is about to make so that you're in a better position to mitigate them. The problem is our students' errors become our new threats. So we have to constantly be on guard to watch that. I was at a presentation in Arizona a few weeks ago, and my very good friend Susan Parson from the FAA was making a presentation on the airman certification standards and was kind of reviewing the progress that's been made. And then I noted that she put up a slide about the instructor ACS, which is not yet done, but she said, the instructor ACS, that's a different kind of a cat, because not only are we trying to teach people how to manage our students and manage that risk, we still have to keep our own skills together. And Phil, I know you've been involved in that, and maybe have some comments.
Yeah, that was one of the most interesting parts from my participation in the ACS. I'd worked on the private, the instrument, and the CFI. And the first two really pretty straightforward. It was going through and basically burnishing the thing and coming up into the structure we're using. But when we got into the flight instructor, we got about 2/3 of the way down the path, and then it started bothering me and a couple of other people. They said, we're leaving something really big out of this. We're saying what the instructor has to convey to the student. But we also have a whole different arena that the instructor is the pilot in command on most activities in an instructional situation, and it's your responsibility to keep it safe. And so you've really got this dual responsibility in the airplane that has presented an interesting challenge going forward in how the instructor ACS is going to be written. We think we've addressed it pretty well by very specifically spelling out the risk management elements and dividing those into the ones that are specifically applicable to the student, and then the ones that are part of the instructor role when the student is playing that role in the check ride of keeping it safe. But it is a challenge. It's one reason that the instructor ACS is quite a bit past the original date. We had hoped to have it out on the street. We are looking at getting the prototyping of it done in June, though, so I think we're back on schedule.
Very good. But thanks for that insight, Phil. I appreciate it. I think we have our last slide coming up now. So just, a quick review. We've covered this before, but, threats are those things that come at us. And, there are three categories. Errors are all the things that are coming from us as a result of a threat. Very important is that a trapped error is absolutely the first step in breaking the chain, towards a undesired aircraft state. Vigilance is probably the most important key to staying on guard, but it's also the most difficult to maintain over time. And as flight instructors, we have to strive to prevent our student errors from becoming our next leak in the chain. Next slide. So if anybody wishes to, correspond with me or contact me, there's two email addresses that would work. And, I'd like to, close out by saying it's been a privilege to be part of this. Phil, you're an excellent host, and I appreciate your contributions, and I hope everybody stays safe out there.
Thank you, Paul, and I'm very glad you could be a part of the presentation, and I'd like to invite you anytime you want to get involved in the future. Be more than happy to have your input, have your program, or whatever contribution you might like to make. We have developed at NAFI this program as an ongoing program, developing a database of various programs on various topics that will be available to people in the industry and folks that are going through instructional process. So again, want to thank you for coming in and taking the time to put this together, and we'll say good night with that.
Take care.
Oh, I'm missing my cue here for the FAA Wings course link. Remember, if you want to do that, you've got to do the completion of it, and you can go onto the website and click on the line, and it'll take you through to finish your work. And of course, our course evaluation link. We would love the feedback. We make programs. It's difficult to be effective if you don't get feedback from the students in a classroom. That's pretty easy, but in a situation like this, we really need your suggestions, anything you had an issue with or questions that you have. We could try to respond to some of those perhaps if you give us contact information, and any evaluation would be very helpful to us. So again, thank you, and we will see you next month.